resubmit this data because it knows that's like a quote dangerous operation. So some of those idempotent functions will be available for you by when you mark the functions with that post mapping. Of course, the others, like this will become a put endpoint, and this will become a get endpoint. So basically able to get all that's available. So the others that we are not using here, like delete mapping, so get, post, put, delete. There are some specialized ones that I don't know whether Spring provides. You can use, okay, let's just focus on the main ones. But anyway, you have post, put, get, and delete. But there's trace and then there's head, which you, from the servlet specification, you can actually define them as endpoints. But I don't know if Spring supports them. It might support trace. Let me just experiment. No, it doesn't support trace. So I think it just supports the main HTTP methods. But if you are writing your own servlet, I think there's a way you can like program it to handle some of those other methods. Okay, so anything you need will be available for like those stereotype annotations. So these annotations receive arguments. The main arguments is the request URI. So this will go to character/create. So that's the endpoint. This one should go to character/edit, and then you're able to pass in an ID. Without going into too much detail, maybe I can just talk about a few things. So from the post mapping annotation, I think we can see that we have the post mapping, which I've explained, that marks this method to process post requests that go to that URI. The other thing in the function arguments, we have this request body annotation. So the request body annotation defines the data that we are receiving to like process the data. You'll notice with the put mapping, so put mapping can also receive a payload. So you'll see it has the request body annotation, and the get mapping it doesn't have a request body. Although in some cases, I think you can plug in the data that you want to pass in through maybe a path variable or a request param. Maybe the other thing here is the response entity. So this allows you to define the nature of the response that you're sending back. By default, the response you're sending back on Spring is JSON. But you can, there's a way you can specify it to return XML. But the default response type is response payload format is JSON. Even the request data that can be processed is JSON. There's an annotation that you can plug in to define this as receiving XML. It's usually plugged in as part of the arguments for the body. So you'll see within the annotation specification, there's this consumes and produces functions. So with this consumes and produces variables of the annotation, you can actually specify that you want to process maybe text data or XML data or JSON data. And I think the way it works is you can say consumes equals media type dot. So there's a few types of media type you can process here. Oh, okay. I didn't know they added GraphQL. Anyway, there's GraphQL there. But anyway, there's application atom XML, and I think this should be familiar if you've ever written like a web endpoint. There's form URL encoded value, so this is very common. So if you're doing HTML form, you'll likely be processing that. So you can specify that, and now this endpoint will be able to receive URL encoded form data. Of course, there's JSON value, which we're using by default, and that will check the request header for type application/JSON. So the client, while sending the data, of course, in the header they'll specify the format of the data they're sending, and that will be able to process application/JSON. So if somebody sends maybe applications, this one URL encoded value, application dash xw dash form, and that. If the endpoint is designed to process JSON data, when somebody sends URL encoded form data, it won't be able to process it. So I think you get like a 500 or you get a 400 bad request when somebody tries to do that. But by default, you're processing JSON. There's a few other data formats here, but of course the most common ones are XML and JSON. Yeah. So I'm seeing even protobuf. I think this would be used if it's a GraphQL endpoint. RSS, XHTML. Oh yeah, this is the main one for processing XML, application dash XML. So this will allow you to receive XML data. Yeah, so you can experiment with some of this. Multi-part form data, this would be if maybe you want to upload a file to the endpoint. Most engineers will use the multi-part form data type to do that. So that's also available for you. So you can actually change the annotation to define what you want to process. So we'll look at what you're receiving from the client. So you can also specify the format of the data you're sending back to the client, and you can do that with producers, and also you can use the same media type class. And media type, you kind of have access to the same methods. So if, for instance, you are returning, let's say, application XML, you can just annotate it with that, and the data that you're returning will be serialized into like XML format. I don't know if David, do you have anything to add regarding the consumes and producers annotations and how you define the data that you want to receive or send back to the client? I turned off this.
No. I completely covered everything.
Okay.
And also I've learned some things, with a person like me who has started learning Java this year. Most of the time we never find examples dealing with the XML. So there's something I'm learning here today with you. I know XML not that well, but I never get a chance to use it. So I'm learning some things here.
Yeah, and with that note, I think I'm also curious because before REST, of course, we had the SOAP protocol, SOAP, and SOAP primarily runs on XML. SOAP protocol. So if let's say, I can find a better spec, just go to Wikipedia. So you'll see SOAP, formerly known as Simple Object, is a messaging protocol, especially for exchanging structured information in the implementation of web services. It uses XML information set and as its message format. So SOAP primarily runs on XML, and if we're in a case where we are integrating with a legacy system, like a bank, I think you would have to form your endpoint in a way that it would be able to handle XML data. If let's say you're using service-to-service communication between your service and that other service that was generated with SOAP, I think in that case you'd like find yourself having to define that XML endpoint, I would imagine. So I guess that's interesting.
Yeah. Because I also saw that even the Spring framework itself, it used to do the configurations with the XML files, but now they do with annotations. So yes, with time, XML is getting slowly kind of, it's not getting so widely unless you're dealing with legacy code.
Oh yeah. So Linux is asking, does it accept an array as well? Array of content types. That's interesting. I've never tried to do that, so let's see if it does. So I think we can get that from the Yeah, I think you can define multiple inputs. I think you could do that, and then media type, maybe define another format, maybe JSON. Yeah, you can define multiple data formats. So I'm curious if you're using that for producers, will it return data in multiple formats? Because for consumers, I understand. If you don't know if somebody will send you XML or JSON, so you might define that, oh, this consumes both XML and JSON. So if you get JSON, the framework will deserialize that from the JSON data. If you get XML, to go deserialize that into your internal objects. But if you're producing data and you've defined multiple formats, I don't know if it will duplicate the payload or what will happen in that case. But yeah, it accepts an array, so you can define multiple. Honestly, I don't know what would end up being the result of doing that. How the response body would look like. It's something that I think I'll experiment with and see. So that the project is not set up to run locally, I need to add some configurations. Otherwise, I would have executed it locally to kind of see. I think when we get to the MockMVC tests, we might execute some of those MockMVC tests and have one of the endpoints defined to receive an array of data formats. Then we can see what the result is. Which kind of the main point. That's kind of what we are driving at, to kind of get the basics of the controllers that we can now bounce back to the MockMVC, to the tests that are testing those endpoints. But I wanted us to just get a basic overview of what's happening with the controllers. Okay, so we've looked at the annotation. So anytime you want to define an endpoint for processing any of this request, you can just use the annotation, and then you specify the URI. So what are these? So these are path variables. So in a case where you want, as part of the request, for somebody to send you data in the URI itself, or the URL, whichever way you want to refer to it. So if there's data that's being sent as part of the request URI, you can use the path variable to allow that data. So this allows for somebody to send something like character. Just use a comment. So somebody can hit character -edit -123. So this would reference the character ID in this case, and that's collected using this path variable annotation. So if you use the path variable annotation, it's able to specify that there's some data within this request URI that I would like to extract it, so that you kind of use it to process the request. So you'll see path variable is referring to ID. If you want to be a bit more specific within this path variable, you can actually pass an argument that specifies the name of the parameter you're extracting from the URI, and that would be that. So that would point it to this. So if you use a different name, of course, it would be able to, because in some cases maybe you're passing multiple data. So maybe ID, and then maybe you're passing name as part of the path variable, and you want to extract both of them. So you'll be able to specify that that way. So in this case, I think when you don't have that argument, it matches the variable name to the name on the request URI, and it's able to extract. That way, I don't think it uses positional. It looks for first one, second one, and then matches the first argument, second argument. I think you look at the name of the variable. But if you want to be specific, you can just specify exactly what the name is on the path. So now, if you wanted to get the name in this case, yeah, I thought those guys came for us again. So I'm gonna be scared. Anyway, let me go back to this. So if you wanted to get the name, we would do path variable, and then we would specify I want to extract the name, and then we'll do string name, and that should help us extract the name from the request. Okay. So I think we have an overview now. I don't think there's an aspect in these endpoints that, oh yeah, we haven't discussed the request params. So this one should be a bit more intuitive if you ever like defined an endpoint. So if you want to pass request parameters as part of your API request, you can specify them with this request param annotation. And you know, when you want to plug in request parameters in your request, you usually use that question mark symbol. So if you are hitting /character/ and then you know you'd say that is equals name is equals to, and then like the name you want to pass in, like maybe say Samuel as part of that request. So if you want to extract those values from the request, you use the request param annotation, and this allows you to pass in the name of the request parameter you want to extract, whether the request has to contain that request parameter with this required check, and then the default value in case the value doesn't exist, and then the variable in which it will be stored. So you can extract multiple request parameters that way, and you can then go ahead to use the request params to process your request. Okay, so I don't know, maybe we can look at some docs regarding request param. So this is the Java doc. It talks about annotation which indicates that a method parameter should be bound to a web request parameter. Support for annotated handler methods in Spring MVC and Spring Web Flags. Yeah, so in simple terms, it just used to extract request params within the request. And the cool thing with the request params, it allows you to really design dynamic API endpoints. Instead of crowding your request URIs with path variables, which is what some people do. So you, like in the case where where I plugged in name, you could find somebody plugging all sorts of other data, like maybe age there, and when you use path variables, this request won't be processed until all those path variables are fulfilled. So it has to be like a complete URL, otherwise the request is not processed. So if you want to like still receive that data and not have to crowd your request URI with path variables, then a request param would be good, because in some cases you can even make some of those request params optional. So let me clean this up so that it doesn't affect our tests. So in a case where somebody's sending me page name status, like in this case, all of them are marked as required false. So you can send page and name and miss out on status. So if somebody just want to filter by name, they can just send in the name, and then for pagination's sake, they can send the page. If they don't need pagination, they can just send the name and the status. And unlike path variables, you don't have to pass all the values. You can pass some of them or none of them, and your request will still be processed. On that now, with the request parameters, they'll be able to like specialize, how your request is handled. I don't know, David, do you have anything to add on the request params? Okay. There we go. You can proceed, David.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to say that whenever the name that we provide there, I think you should go back to the endpoint. Yeah, so the name that we are providing for that request param must match what the front-end guys will give you in the URL. So they have to match those page. It has to be exactly the same, otherwise we'll have problems. Yeah, and also I think you should mention something about the @valid annotation, because I did not hear you talk about it. It's in the endpoints.
Oh yeah, I was running from it because last time we had a whole 30 minutes discussing it. And it brings in things related to AOP, but I know you have something to add on that annotation. So I think when we get to it, I'll give you a chance to talk more about it. But you can imagine last time we got into it, and then it took us to AOP, and that became some other. So for the sake of not repeating too much, maybe I won't get into it, but I'll give you a chance to add in some more context.
All right.
Okay, great. Yeah, so by the way, there's something I didn't get in your explanation. You said the front-end guys have to match the name. Did you mean they have to pass in all the request params, or they have to match the name of the request parameter? Okay. Yeah, there you go.
Oh, I was saying whenever they pass in the name, it just match what you expect. If it's a page, just be the name that it just match that one. Whenever it's passed, just match. So you have to be in communication with the guys.
Yeah, and I think with that, if you have like some good API documentation, I think it can help with that. So after you're done, you document the API and give the front-end guys so that they don't keep interrupting you and asking you, what did you label in that path variable, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, good. Yeah, so we look at the request params. So I think before we go to the tests, let's talk a bit about this at valid annotation. So this comes in the topic of validation. We discussed this in length last time. So I'll just give it to David to add some more context on what we're using that at valid annotation for. But yeah, let me just delegate to him. So because if I start explaining, I'll go into some other concepts that might take us along to cover.
Oh yeah. Mine is not much. I just wanted to say whenever you have a request body and you are that valid, it will just activate the validation of that request body so that the Spring MVC can just have a look at whatever you are setting with is validated from, according to what you prescribed in your validators. So that annotation itself is just to make sure that the request body is being validated.
Oh yeah, and it falls back to the validators that you wrote when maybe he wants to actually check the values, right?
Yeah. If you don't put it, it won't be checked.
Okay. And the validators that we are talking about are within this packet. So this is one of the annotations that we that you defined for handling some of the validation. Yeah.
I just wanted to say I use the switch expressions that are in Java 21. I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah.
They're actually nice to use because I would have written I think 3 cases now to check if something is alive. Dead or unknown.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a nice touch. But otherwise, this is, for example, one of the validators that you're referring to in this case. I'm just curious. Maybe you can explain how does Spring know which validator, how to validate the values that are being passed in. Just for a chance for you to explain a bit. I know we covered it last time. I'm avoiding me explaining because I might stretch it out too long. But maybe let me fall back on you on this. So how does Spring know when you do at validation how to validate and what to validate?
Yeah. So this as we explained last time, it's about the aspect-oriented programming. So the moment you indicate at valid on that request body, so that annotation itself will kind of form what I think they call them point cards. So in the aspects of the, I think you should go back to where we had the validators.
Oh yeah, like the validate status.
Where we have the validators in the entity that is coming in the DTOs.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's actually where we are heading to. Yeah, so like this edit character DTO, right?
So that one, yeah, go to where it is defined. So yeah, so we have these annotations. They are implemented in the Spring framework. whereby they are using what we call the AOP. So whenever anything is annotated with at valid in the endpoint, the Spring and aspect-oriented programming bits in the framework will know that this body that I'm receiving, I'm supposed to run it through the everything that is annotated with a specific annotation. So for example, if the request body contains a name, I should check the whole body where it is defined. In our case, we have the DTO that is coming in. For example, in our case, you have edit character DTO. So I'm supposed to check the fields and whatever is coming from in the endpoint. I compare both of them and see if they match. If they don't match, I throw an exception. When I throw an exception, this an exception is supposed to be caught by the aspect. Now in our case, we have the aspect first controller advice. That's the aspect that is supposed to be gathering anything that is thrown. Since we said for the aspect-oriented programming, whenever something happens before a method, after a method, or before a method is executed, do something. So in this case, if an exception is thrown before you do anything else, I don't know, make the response entity and return it to the endpoint, something like that. I may be kind of rusty on how you're supposed to explain this, but you get the idea. So whenever an exception is thrown from building validations, it's not supposed to be returned as a response entity from this aspect. Yeah, I don't know if you have something to add. I'm a little bit rusty in explanations.
Yeah. I would add something, but you've explained it really well. But also, we have like a almost 30-minute long explanation from the previous session that's available. So we, like I said, we archive our sessions on YouTube. So David did a really good explanation. I shared a clip on Twitter of him explaining how that mechanism works. And it's nice that he has added a bit more context with his current explanation. So thanks for that, David. So I think now we've kind of played around with the controllers, so we can go to like how do you test these controllers. So Spring has this concept of MockMVC. So when you've defined an endpoint, that endpoint is supposed to receive HTTP requests and process those HTTP requests and send out HTTP responses. So Spring MockMVC allows you to simulate the HTTP request response cycle using that MockMVC framework. So I think you can look at the docs for it. Spring MockMVC. And the docs will, they've actually structured it so well, so it will guide us in how we cover it. So the Spring MVC test framework, also known as MockMVC, provides support for testing Spring MVC applications. It performs full Spring MVC request handling, but via mock requests. So mock is, I think you can look at it as another way of saying fake or emulated request. So it's not the real HTTP request. And response objects instead of running a server. So we won't put up a whole server to test our HTTP endpoints. And that's really nice and powerful. So MockMVC can be used on its own to perform requests and verify responses. It can also be used through web test client, where MockMVC is plugged in as the server to handle requests with. The advantage of web test client is the option to work with higher level objects instead of raw data. So there's a bit more explanation, but the main one we need to remember is this. So you can mock those request response cycles or request response objects without putting up a whole server. And the way you go about it is, I think it's covered somewhere here. Setup choices, yeah. Okay, I think it's under static imports. So the way you set up the MockMVC test is using these 4 objects. So there's this MockMVC builder. So the MockMVC builder allows you to create a MockMVC instance, basically to create an instance of the framework that allows you to emulate the request response cycle. The other thing you need is the MockMVC request builders. So this allow you to do the get, post, put those specific HTTP methods, and they're doing those HTTP methods on the MockMVC, on the framework that's simulating the HTTP request response objects. And then there's this result matcher. So once you've sent out quote unquote fake HTTP response, and you get a fake HTTP, you send out a fake HTTP request and you get a fake HTTP response, the result match allows you to now evaluate that result and do things like checking whether the data that you're expecting to come from that endpoint actually come from that endpoint, the status that you expect to come from that endpoint based on the data you sent. So you can basically do assertions with the result matcher. Then you have the result handlers. So this allows you to do assertions. So you can assert that the response is in the structure that you expected it to be. The result handlers allow you to do more with the response that you get. So you can print the response. You can end you can close the HTTP connection or something like that, or you can end that request response icon. Main thing that I've done with these result handlers is just to print that HTTP request response so that you see, that simulation, instead of just relying on the assertions. So an easy way to remember that is search for MockMVC. That anyway, we will be able to see that within the code. So once you have these 4 objects, you're good to go. So let's look at performing HTTP requests. So you'll see there is mockmvc.perform, and then you pass in the request URI, or the endpoint that you're trying to reach. You can do this with multipart, you can do it with get requests, you can do post requests, and with post requests you can even pass in a payload that matches the payload that you expect on the real endpoint. So just like the others, I would encourage you to pick up these after this session, and you guys can just go through it, and so there's some interesting things you can pick. So even async requests are supported. There's a way you do set up for async requests, and you can do assertions to see how they are processed. So let's go back to our own MockMVC tests. So we have this show character controller test, and the first thing you'll notice, the show character